Well, welcome back to the fifth talk in our summer series on the broad-reaching work that goes on at the Florida Museum of Natural History, the thing that goes on behind the walls that we don't get to see when we visit the exhibits. The original plan, as advertised in the bulletin, had Dr. John Block talking about the age of dinosaurs. But we were advised last week that Dr. Block would be unavailable because of a death in his family. But the wonderful Brittany Snipes, the museum coordinator who put together this original group of speakers, quickly found Dr. Edward Stanley to talk to us today. Dr. Stanley has a BS in science from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, a master's degree in biology from Villanova, and a PhD from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He did postdoctoral work at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco before joining the Florida Museum in 2015, where he's presently the director of Digital Discovery, the Digital Discovery Laboratory, which uses computerized tomography to study the inner workings of animals. He's also a longtime associate editor of the African Journal of Herpetology, the study of amphibians and reptiles. And the title of his talk today is Scaled Up Defenses, Evolution of Bony Armor in Vertebrates. So please welcome Dr. Edward Stanley.
Hello, am I on? Oh, I'm on.
You're on.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, it's a genuine delight to be here. Thanks so much for joining us here. And, oh yeah, let's go get my slides up. Perfect. So let's go backwards here. There we go. All right, got it. There we go. Yes, I know, I've given away the ending. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the evolution of armor in vertebrates, so principally in lizards here. And I thought I'd always start with a little bit of background on me. So I don't think I was ever destined to be a hairdresser or a fashion model, but when I was a kid, I grew up in the south of England, on the south coast of England, in Dorset, in a little village, and we were about through 2.5, 3 hours away from London. We didn't go into the city that much, but every time we did, I was going to say begged, but I basically demanded that my parents take us to natural history museums. I love museums in all shapes and forms, but I always demanded on going to natural history museums and history museums, my favorite things. And when I was there, I had two very specific agendas. I was a dinosaur kid. Some of my first words were dinosaur names. That's an extreme thing. Obviously, that's a weird thing to admit to. But I'd always like to go to the dinosaur halls and see the dinosaurs if it was a natural history museum. And if it was a people museum, a history museum, I'd always go and see the armor and the weapons and things. I wasn't a violent kid. I was just fascinated by that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. I get very excited. So I realized that in my undergraduate, when I was 20 or so, that you can actually have a career working in museums. There was a place where real people lived and worked. Well, worked. Sometimes it feels like you live there. So I came to America to do my PhD and did my PhD at the American Museum of Natural History, which is in New York City, and it's a very old museum, one of the older museums in America, in the world actually. 1869 is when it was founded. And spent 4 years there working on evolution and genetic relationships of lizards. And then I moved across America to San Francisco at the California Academy of Sciences, where I did a postdoc with Dave Blackburn, who's next week's speaker, working on biogeography, so where animals live and don't live in Africa, specifically on frogs. And then I came all the way back to the best museum of all, which is the Florida Museum of Natural History. I also noticed that I'm working in progressively flatter and flatter buildings as my career goes on. So I came to the Florida Museum of Natural History, where I was initially a postdoc and then stepped into the role of the digital imaging director at the division there. And all the way through my graduate career and onwards, I've been working on this group of animals. So these are the squamates, is the scientific name for them, but you might know them as lizards and snakes. They're in the reptile class, and they are the most diverse of all tetrapod or land vertebrates lineages. So there's 11 and a half, nearly 11 and a half thousand species of snakes and lizards. And they occur in all kinds of different habitats and all amazingly diverse environments and across the world. So we have, sorry, there you go, getting used to the buttons. We have sea snakes and things that live up in trees, like iguanas, and things that live in the deserts. Lizards that look like snakes, and lizards that look like fish, and all kinds of wonderful things. Chameleons, of course. Lizards that look like worms. Lizards that look like, I don't even know what you describe this thing as, like as a worm with a forearms. Anyway, yes. But they're a remarkably diverse and interesting group of animals. And one of my favorite things about lizards is that just how they're the little guy, you know? It's hard to be a lizard. You know, Kermit the Frog said it's not easy being green. Well, he was right, but he's talking about lizards rather than frogs. They tend to be small, they tend to be insectivorous, and so therefore they tend to be on the dinner plate for a lot of different terrifying, monstrous creatures, including things like this camel spider here, which is a genuinely frightening animal. In fact, this has been known for a long time. And I always like to have a little bit of art history in my talks if I can, shoehorn it in. Does anyone know what this is? Hieronymus Bosch, yes, great. Okay, fantastic. So this is the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, a Dutch painter from about 1505 to 1515 is when this is dated. And it's a triptych, so it's painted in 3 parts, and it denotes heaven and hell and everything in between. Don't look too closely down here. But I like to show this because in the bottom left-hand side, in the heavenly Garden of Eden, we have Garden Adam and Eve. Sorry about the nudity. Garden Adam and Eve tooling around the Garden of Eden. Lots and lots of fruit on the trees and no fig leaves in sight yet. So this is before the fall of man and the advent of death. And even before the advent of death, there's a cat eating a lizard there. So you know that even Hieronymus Bosch, who was not, I think, a trained herpetologist, recognized this trait in lizards, that they're dinner for a lot of things. But of course, the amazing thing about being so heavily predated and having so many, what was it? Watership Down said, the prince with 1,000 enemies. They're having so many different types of predators. They've evolved amazing range of ways of avoiding being dinner. So, firstly, not being seen at all is one of the best ways you can avoid being eaten. So crypsis or camouflage. So this is the satanic leaf-tailed gecko from Madagascar. It looks like a leaf. There's obviously chameleons are famous for this, but there's also New World equivalents like anolis lizards have amazing crypsis. So the anolis is here. This is a chameleolus here on the bark here. So so that's one you find in Cuba and actually in Miami these days. And lots of desert-dwelling animals, lots and lots of desert-dwelling snakes and lizards. And I don't know if you can see. Can you see the snake in this bottom right-hand image there? Yes, exactly. So this is a Perengway's adder. So its eyes are just above the thing. So this is all sand, and you can just see the top of its head sticking out of the sand here. So a beautiful example of using the environment to hide in. And then I don't know if I can turn the volume down. I'm getting a little bit of hum. Is it? Can you guys hear me okay, or is this okay? That's fine. Okay, is it slower? Of course, absolutely. Yeah, I know. Well, usually you can put subtitles on when people like me talk, but it's not working. Okay, I need to invent that. Okay, so yes, and then we also have. We have individuals that can adapt to local environments like this. This is a race runner or a whiptail lizard that lives on white sands. This is a population that lives on white sands. This is a population that lives on regular or darker sands. And so they can actually change the color of their bodies within a few generations to adapt to different environments. They have a range of really interesting chemical defenses as well, including essentially being able to mace or pepper spray their predators, like this spitting cobra from Africa, a Mozambican spitting cobra. And so they've turned their offensive weaponry, their venom in their fangs, into a defensive structure where they can aerosolize spray this venom, and if it gets into your eyes, it's a very, very bad situation. This is another example of doing something like that is from these horny toads from Southwest United States. You might have seen these if you ever go out to Arizona or California. There are lots of these around, and they can actually pressurize the capillaries in their eyeballs to squirt out blood out of their eyes into the mouths of predators. And the blood, because they eat a lot of ants, is very, very bitter and unpleasant to the predators. So it actually works very well for coyotes. Turns out it doesn't work very well for house cats, which is why they're endangered now, because they're getting in trouble because house cats like eating these things. They don't run very fast. They just have this spiky defense and blood jetting things. There are other species that have lots and lots of interesting chemical defenses, like venom. So it's not just snakes that have venom. It's lizards as well. So this is a Gila monster from Arizona. Actually, this might be a Mexican beaded lizard from Mexico. But 2 species of lizards are known to have actual venom when they have venom fangs, just like a snake does. And then this is my favorite one of all. This in the bottom right-hand side here. This is Stropurus. This is a gecko from Australia that has a very interesting defense. It has these pressurized sacs of goop in its tail that it can contract and spray goop out of its tail. And this goop is I know it's kind of upsetting, isn't it? But this is a very unpleasant and bitter tasting thing that also prevents. So spraying nasty things into animals' mouths is another way that these snakes and lizards can avoid predation. Lots of really interesting behavioral adaptations, like feigning death. So this is, I think, a grass snake that's feigning death. So it turns upside down and holds its mouth open and smells pretty bad. They don't smell great at the best of times. But it smells even worse when it's feigning death, and so animals think, oh, it's a dead, rotten snake, I won't eat that. There's lots of really interesting defensive posturing, like this frilled lizard here. So this is an Australian lizard that can extend these big flaps on the side of its head. If you've ever seen Jurassic Park, you see that they co-opted this. When you think about warning signs in snakes and lizards, I think the thing that jumps to mind immediately is rattlesnakes shaking their tail, giving you an audible clue that they're around. But there's lots of snakes that do this without rattles. They actually shiver their scales together to make a similar sort of rattle noise. And then there's this thing called aposematic coloration, where if you are dangerous animal and you don't want to have to defend yourself in person, you can actually advertise how dangerous you are by being brightly colored. So coral snakes do this. Several other snakes do this, and it's such an efficient defense that other snakes that aren't venomous will copy the venomous snakes to get some of that protection for themselves. So they'll be brightly colored, just like the coral snakes are. And you see this, and that color pattern matches as the color pattern changes across the environment. Penultimately, there are lots of really interesting escape behaviors. So everybody knows, or most people think about lizards, think about the lizard's ability to lose their tails. It's called tail autotomy, the ability to lose your tail and grow it back later. And they actually they do this by breaking the center of the vertebra in the tail to release the tail. So this is kind of a really specific thing to lizards. Snakes don't actually do this, just lizards. There are other methods of escaping by dropping body parts, including this isn't an old chicken cutlet. This is a gecko that has lost its scales. So there's a species from Madagascar of gecko that can drop its scales. So when an animal grabs it, the skin falls off and it runs to safety and regrows the skin. This is obviously an extreme version. This looks like a thawed out chicken nugget, doesn't it? But it's not. This is a gecko. There are other escape behaviors like running across water, like the basilisk lizard, and then literal flight behaviors like this Draco lizard from Southeast Asia that has these very long ribs that have skin stretched between them, and it can flatten them out into wings and jump out of trees and glide to safety. So that's another thing. But the thing I'm here to talk about today, and the thing that I think unites all lizards and snakes, is the armor that they have. So lizards and snakes, the squamates, are known as the scaled reptiles. So these are the scales are the things that really tie all of these animals together. And you can see these scales can be spiky, they can be flat, they can be ridged, they can be spiky again, they can be granular. There's a lot of variation in the type of scales. And these scales are made up of keratin, just like you have in your hair and in your fingernails. But not all armor in lizards is equal. So if we look at two Australian lizards here, we have the Morlock, or the thorny devil from Australia. I guess they're both from Australia. The thorny devil, and then this is called the pinecone skink, or Taliqua. If we look at the external anatomy, they're both impressively armored. But if we look under the skin and look at the dense parts of the anatomy here, we'll see that the thorny devil just has a regular skeleton, like you or I do. Well, not exactly like you or I do, but it has a regular skeleton. Whereas the pinecone skink has an endoskeleton, like a regular vertebrate does, but it also has these bony plates all embedded across the skin here as a suit of armor, and almost like an exoskeleton, like an insect would have, right? So these are called osteoderms. So these osteoderms, osteo, bone, derm, dermis, skin, so bones in the skin. And these occur across the squamate snake and lizard tree of life. So as I mentioned before, there's nearly 11,500 species of squamates, and they're the most diverse tetrapods. But osteoderms, here highlighted in green here, and you see this, are present in 13 families, about 30% of all lizard families, and about 40% of lizard genera. And they've evolved 7 times independently. So 7 different lineages of lizards have gone from having no osteoderms to having osteoderms. They've evolved it 7 times independently. So there's obviously some strong pressure, some strong evolutionary selection pressure to evolve some kind of additional armor to supplement the scales that you already have in this group. And these lizards that are armored have a lot of different ecological variation, like they live in rocks, and they live on the ground, and they live in water and up trees and underground. So there's a lot of variation there. Oh, here's the 7 different independent origins. So just to go through real quick, we have the main groups of lizards and snakes. So we have geckos. You might have seen these running around on the walls around here. This is actually a very, very diverse group of lizards, and one of the earliest diverging groups of lizards. So they include things that look like snakes, but are actually geckos. This is a legless gecko from Australia, Lialis. There's our fat friend, the fish-scaled gecko that sheds its skin from Madagascar. They include some of the smallest lizards, smallest vertebrates in the world, including these little dwarf geckos from the Caribbean. And then some, then when you think of geckos, you often think about these tree-dwelling, arboreal specialists like this Uroplatus here. And so geckos have 3 independent origins of armor. They have this kind of chainmail type armor over here. This is more like a kind of a protective helmet type thing here with the gecko. So this is Tarantola gecko, or the tokay gecko. That's this guy here. And then here's our fish-scaled gecko here. The next group that I wanted to talk about is the skinks and the skinkomorphs. So these are my favorite group of animals. They're just spectacular. I know you might have seen some skinks running around outside here. So the blue-tailed skinks, that's part of this group here. So they have a blue tail to attract predators to attack their tail rather than the important parts up here. So they include the skinks, like this guy and this guy. They include the night lizards, which are a family of unarmored but very beautiful lizards from central and southwest United States and Central America. And then there's the plated lizards, the gerasaurs from Madagascar and South Africa, and then my personal favorite, the girdled lizards from South Africa as well, Southern Africa as well. And you see that there's 3 major radiations within this group that all have this very impressive armor, including our friend the pinecone skink here, that is one of the most armored lizards in the world. We have another group called the lateratans that are very weird. They contain very normal-looking lizards and very weird-looking lizards. So we have our normal-looking lacertids. These are the wool lizards and green lizards from Europe and the Old World. We have our teids, or these amoebas and things like that you might find around here. Whiptail lizards as well. If you ever go out to the Lachua Trail, you might see, not this guy, but you'll see some things that look like this running around, and those are whiptail lizards. And then you also have these very, very, again, our friend here with the four legs and a worm body here. So this is Bipes, this is a Mexican worm lizard, and then this is our friend, the Florida worm lizard. So you actually find this creature in the sand around here. So when on a rainy day, in a very heavy rain, you might see some of these washed up, and it looks like an earthworm, but it's actually a lizard. It has a skull and everything. I won't show you the skull because it's genuinely frightening. But the lacertids, the wool lizards, have osteoderms as well, but they're really just retained in the head here. How am I doing on time? Oh, plenty of time. Good. I'll slow down some more. Then we have not a final group, but another group, very diverse, very interesting, and I think some of the best known lizards in the world. These are the anguillemorph lizards, they're called, but they include things like the world's biggest lizard, the Komodo dragon. Most varanids, most monitor lizards aren't this big. They're small and live up in trees or in the desert, like this guy here. Maybe with the tail about this big, but they get. Sorry, you can't see it. I'm holding my hands up about a foot apart. So yes, most varanids are pretty small, but they also include things like the Gila monster, the venomous lizard from before, and these beautiful arboreal alligator lizards that live up in trees in Central America, and these knob-scaled lizards also from Central America. And you see that the diversity of armor in this group, so the armor is all highlighted in green here. There's a big diversity in not only the amount and the shape of the armor, but the distribution of the armor as well. So some of the animals have it only on the head, like this xenosaur. Some have it all over the body, and then everything in between. I think when people think of lizards, they often think of iguanids. So that's things like iguana, anolis that you have around here, that we have around here, I should say, but also includes things like chameleons and agamid lizards from Africa, that sort of thing, and Draco, the flying lizards. So there's only one species of iguanid that has armor that we know of as of yet, and this was only discovered in 2017. So this is I tell a lie, 2019 this was discovered. So there's one species, a very, very small chameleon, once again from Madagascar, something weird going on with that island, that has osteoderms. And this is one of the very, very smallest lizards in the world. This thing is maybe 15 millimeters nose to tail. It's very, very small, but has osteoderms. And then the final group of squamates that I'm not going to talk about much today, but have absolutely no bony armor in their skin, are the snakes. And this kind of makes sense that bony armor in the skin never evolved in snakes, because they have to be, if you ever seen a snake move, they have to be fairly flexible. Everything about their daily existence is tied to being a fairly flexible, sinewy, movable creature, right? They're just a head on a long rib cage. So if you can't move that rib cage, you can't really do much. The only animal that we thought might have armor in this group is this dragon lizard, the dragon snake from Java, and they have these very, very pronounced ridges on their skin. We CT scanned that and found actually that there's no bone in the skin, but what these ridges are supported by are the individual vertebrae. So there are these very large projections out of the backbone that provide the same level of support as an osteoderm would, but it's not developed in the skin. So there's an amazing diversity of armor, an amazing diversity in the distribution and the morphology of this armor, which is, again, speaks to the childhood, 10-year-old Ed who's going out and bullying his parents into going to museums. And so I can't help but see the connections between the anthropological side of things and the natural history side of things, right? And neither could previous researchers before me. So this is a cataphract armor from the Byzantine period in so Eastern Europe in the 10th century, and you can see that these plates arranged in whorls around the rib cage here and on the arms, and it's very similar to the plates, the big square plates that you see arranged around this armadillo lizard. And in fact, the name Ouroboros cataphractus, the scientific name, you see that cataphractus comes from the term for this very specific kind of armor. So it wasn't just me who noticed that. There's lots and lots of examples of fish mail or fish scale mail throughout history. Here's some 17th century Polish fish scale mail. And again, this is replicated beautifully by our friend, the fish-scaled gecko here, but also in skinks and other lizards as well. There's no examples of interlocking links like chainmail in lizards because the development of that would be quite difficult to pull off. But there are plenty of monitor lizards that have essentially chainmail in their arms. They have these very curly bones that kind of interconnect with one another and act like chainmail, like you would see in Europe and the Middle East in the 15th, and well, really from the 9th century onwards. Brigandine armor is leather armor with metal plates sewn into it. And so that, again, like chainmail, provides a very flexible but good protection. And you see a similar sort of thing happening in Gila monsters here. This is a Heloderma horridum. This is a Mexican beaded lizard. But you see these isolated pieces of bone embedded in the skin, just like you see with brigandine armor. And then I really struggled to come up with a good example in squamates of plate armor, right? This is your kind of classic knights in shining armor, Camelot type armor here. This is from the 16th century, but they had this a little earlier. And it's because lizards can't really afford to do this, right? Where these knights and warriors could take this armor off when they needed to sleep or go to the toilet or do other things that require a lot of lateral movement. But lizards can't do that. So they can't be in these all encased solid blocks of armor. Broadlysaurus is a gyrosaur that is probably the closest to doing this. And you see it has this break in its armor here, and that's to allow it to expand and contract when it's full of food or it's full of babies or it needs to breathe. So they have to have these hinges in the armor. But of course, all of these bony plates articulate as well, so they're able to move from side to side as well. There is one group of reptiles that do encase themselves in a full protective coat of armor. Does anyone think of what that might be? Yeah, I hear turtles and tortoises. Yes, exactly. So they've committed fully to this kind of lifestyle, but of course that makes them very slow, although they can move fairly quickly if they need to in some cases. But they make them. They've gone so far into this that they've had to convert everything about themselves into being essentially an armored tank. So lizards don't do that. So my research is really inspired by this diversity of armor. And so, I ask ourselves, well, why is there so much diversity? How can there be so much diversity, and where is this diversity located within the lizards? So you think it's 2022, everything's been done already. We've had, 3 centuries of science. Why hasn't this all been taken care of? That's because traditionally museum specimens that are skeletonized tend to be disarticulated and found in boxes like this. So this is what was Cordalis cataphractus, now Ouroboros cataphractus. And this is what the skeleton of an Ouroboros cataphractus looks like in the museum. And I went through yesterday just to show you what that means. So here's all I went through and sorted this out. So here's our long bones. These are the arms and legs. Here's the pelvis and pectoral girdle. This is all the bones of the skull. And then this is the backbone here. And all of this are the bones in the skin. These are the osteoderms. I couldn't imagine trying to sort out which bone went where, right? But luckily for us, we have new technology. Well, it's technology from the 1970s that we've now finally adopted into museum research in the term of CT scanning. computer tomography. So you might have seen CT scans at hospitals. These are a little different. These are industrial CT scanners. So we have, but it's essentially the same process as a medical CT scanner. You have an X-ray source that produces X-rays. You have a detector that captures X-rays, and you have a place where the specimen or the sample or the person, in the case of medical CT scanners, sit in the middle. The X-ray source produces X-rays, shines through the sample, and projects a shadow onto the detector. And so the dense parts absorb X-rays, the lower density parts let the X-rays through, and you end up with an image, that looks a little bit like this. So there's our frog sitting on the stage here, and we can see the detector shows up there. Now, with a medical CT scanner, the distance is fixed, but with an industrial CT scanner, we're actually able to move the distance between the sample and the X-ray source to project a larger shadow onto the detector, which means that we can zoom in essentially to get very high resolution images on of our samples. And so the smaller the sample, the bigger we can magnify it. So we can scan, insects on this thing. We can do all kinds of wonderful things. Once we've got our sample positioned, we rotate it 360 degrees, just like in a medical CT scanner, except in a medical CT scanner, the X-ray source and the detector move around you. In this machine, the specimen spins around. And we end up with a series of two-dimensional X-rays. So this is just an X-ray image of an object, of a frog here. But if I show you the series as it rotates, this looks three-dimensional to you, or it looks three-dimensional to me. It may not look three-dimensional to you, but you can see the three-dimensionality to it, right? Because it's moving in a predictable way. And that's all the computer tomography does, is it takes that predictable X-ray movement and works out where the high and low density areas are and creates these tomograms or slices across the body to show where the high and low density areas are. We take those tomograms, those slices, and we can stack them up like a deck of cards and then project them into a volume, which we can then, hopefully, yes, we can then visualize in 3 dimensions again. So we've gone from taking a series of two-dimensional X-rays to a series of two-dimensional slices to a 3-dimensional volume again. So it's essentially, that's a long way of saying that we can turn this disarticulated specimen into a fully 3-dimensionally articulated specimen that we can see where all the bones are. And this is great when we're trying to understand the distribution and the diversity of osteoderms, lizard osteoderms, because we can actually get volumetric measurements from that. We can get length-to-length measurements from that. And we can also segment out other parts. So we can take the osteoderms from the back and the tail and the belly and the legs, segment them out individually and get the volumes of that. So we can actually get an understanding of the distribution of armor in this group. So I've done this for about 230 specimens now. And I've taken measurements from all of these things and I've plugged them into an analysis. And so this is kind of a little complicated, but essentially all you have to know is that I've taken a bunch of characters and squashed them down to 2 different axes. So I've done it's called a principal component analysis, and basically taken all the correlated traits that explain most of the variation, put them on one axis and all of them on the other. And what that actually means in real life is that each of these dots represents an individual animal that I've analyzed, and the colors here, you can see them very well on the screen, the colors and the colored polygons represent different groups within the lizards. So this big group here are the girdled lizards, this green group here are the monitor lizards, these are things like glass lizards, and then this is a skinks here. So the animals that fall out on the left-hand side of the chart tend to be fairly squat and flattened and stout. Things that live over here, found over here, are long and skinny like a snake. So that's what sorts out on this axis. On the other axis, we have things that are heavily armored down the bottom here and things that are lightly armored on the top here. And staring at this long enough, with enough desperation as a scientist, you can actually start seeing patterns in what these animals are doing. So we have the morphological area here. So, we know what these things all look like, but we can also divide this into what these things are doing. And that's interesting So the things on the left-hand side tend to be animals that live in rocks. The things on the right-hand side up here tend to be grass swimming or living in vegetation and using their long tails to move through that vegetation. Things down here tend to be burrowing animals. And then on the on the y-axis here, we have things that live in three-dimensional environments up here, things that live in trees or live in water, and things that live in two-dimensional environments, burrowing or living on the ground down here. I was really interested in this area here because this is an area where there's not an awful lot of overlap of other things, right? There's just one family in this area that really is, I guess, occupying this area of morphospace. And these are the chordilids. The chordilids are the African girdled lizards, and there's about 80 or so species of them. They come in all kinds of interesting shapes and flavors. I don't know if that's the right word. Spiky, smooth, flat, round, snake-like. They have these amazing things that look like, they look like mythological creatures, right? This is our friend, the armadillo lizard. Has amazing behavior, curl up in a ball and bite its tail to stop it from being swallowed by snakes. And they all live in this very specific habitat, which is in rock cracks. They live in different kinds of rock cracks, but they all live, or most of them live, in these very, very narrow, rocky environments in South Africa. So I looked at this, I zoomed in on this and looked at the individual genera, so the next level of detail down in the family, and could see that the vast majority of these lizards, the genera here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 genera, occupy this area here, which overlaps with a lot of other lizards like skinks and other terrestrial animals. But there was, and you can see they're all heavily armored and spiky and nice and defensive. The other group up here are 3 different genera, 3 different groups of lizards that are not each other's closest relative, but all live in this area of morphospace here. So we have the flat lizards, Platysaurus, the crag lizards, Pseudocordylus, and the cliff lizards, Hemicordylus. And you see they're not each other's closest relatives, but they all live in this environment. So this morphospace. So they've converged, they've grown together on this one morphology. That morphology is armor in the tail, armor on the limbs, a little bit of armor on the head, but no armor on the body. So what is it that's driving this very specific morphology? Well, if you look at, if you draw a divide along here, you can sort these things out by things that live in big rocks, like cliffs and boulders and crags, and things that live in more open habitat, like on the sides of mountains in gravel and smaller rocks. And that makes sense if you think that if you have access to high quality retreat sites, you can hide under a really big rock that can't be moved. The best thing to do is to be as fast as you can possibly be to get under that rock, right? If you're living in open environments that maybe a predator could roll the rock over, maybe you want to focus a little bit more on your own personal protection rather than relying on the environment to protect you. It's also that these things might be in more three-dimensional environments. So that's what I've been mostly focusing on. But as I work with other people at the museum, people like John Block, people like Dave Blackburn, people in the ichthyology department, the mammalogy department, I realized that actually these osteoderms are not just a thing that lizards have, but all kinds of animals have osteoderms or bony dermal elements in the skin, right? There's in fact 30 different independent origins of dermal armor across the vertebrate tree of life. That is remarkable. That is weird. Why do these, eyes have evolved 20 different times across life? Why is it that the bony armor keeps on re-evolving over and over and over again, right? Obviously, it has a very important function in defense, but how is it able to keep on re-evolving when the genes behind it haven't been expressed in 200, 300 million years? I mean, like really, really long periods between these things. If you think about it, it starts with sharks, as it always does. Sharks have armor in their skin. This armor is not bone because sharks don't have bone, but it's modified teeth. So the teeth and the scales of sharks called denticles, and and they're very similar to teeth. Now, whether the scales came first and the teeth followed, or vice versa, is another really interesting talk that you should get Gareth Fraser, who's also at UF, to talk about. Fish have all kinds of wonderful bony armor in their skin, including things like your lovely alligator gar that we have in Florida here, and sticklebacks, and seahorses, and armored catfish. But basically, every fish has some amount of bone in their skin, because fish scales have a bony element to them. You don't think of amphibians, or certainly I don't think of amphibians as being particularly robust armored creatures, but there are species of frog that have legitimate osteoderms, bony plates in their skin, including things like this big Pac-Man frog that presumably uses this as a kind of defensive structure when it's lunging at its prey. It's not a particularly discerning frog, this. It'll bite at anything, so having a big plate to protect its kidneys and things is probably a good idea. And of course, reptiles is the one that we've been talking about for a long time, but it's not just lizards and snakes. There's also alligators and crocodiles have osteoderms, and turtles also have osteoderms. Birds have gone the other way. You know, birds don't really go in for armor, because their main defense is being able to fly up into a tree or fly away, and so they've actually committed a lot to reducing the amount of bone that they have in their system. So they have a lot of fusing of their skeleton. They have a lot of their bones are fairly hollow and light. But of course, when you consider that birds are very, very specialized kinds of dinosaurs, there are plenty of extinct bird lineage creatures that had osteoderms, including Stegosaurus, again, one of my very first words, and Argentosaurus, which wasn't even described by the time I was born. And then finally, we have mammals. And so there are species of mammals that have osteoderms, and traditionally, this is restricted to one group, the armadillos and their close relatives. So armadillos, these are two South American armadillos, but the armadillos we have around here also have osteoderms. There are, in fact, species of extinct giant ground sloths that have osteoderms as well, but they also belong in this group. But as part of this digitization program that you'll hear about next week from Dave Blackburn, we have actually discovered an entirely new lineage of mammal that has osteoderms. And there's this one group of mice from Africa, again from Africa, the spiny mice. And so this is a group that looks like a regular rodent, looks like a regular mouse, but its tail is covered in these bony plates. There it is, cute little spiny mouse. And these bony plates, these osteoderms in the tail here, look just like the osteoderms of lizards, which is bizarre, because these two animals had a common ancestor in the Permian. You know, it's a long, long time ago. That's 300 odd million years ago. That's amazing amount of time between re-evolving these types of structures. Luckily for us, it turns out when we discovered this, I found out that there's actually a lab with Acames, these spiny mice, at UF. It was, divine providence almost. We found this thing, and then I reached out to Malcolm Madden, who's at the biology department in UF, and he has a live colony of spiny mice. And so we were able to do all of these additional experiments, clearing and staining, histological sectioning, like feeding the tissues through like a deli slicer, essentially. Very high resolution imaging with CT scanning, and then also most importantly, which is not something I've talked about yet, is doing some genetic analysis. And so we were able to take these specimens and look at the genes associated with the expression of the bone in the skin. And this is fascinating, because I think this can help us answer some of the questions. And this is, I think, my favorite bit about this whole talk, how crazy this is. It asks some of the questions about why osteoderms are able to re-evolve over and over and over again when the genes that code for them aren't expressed. And it's because the genes associated with the osteoderms might be the same genes that are associated with your ability to build a skull. And what do I mean by that? Well, it turns out that vertebrate skeletons, or at least bony vertebrate skeletons, are derived from two very separate origins. We have most of our skeleton, all the arms and the rib cage and the backbone and tail, for those of us that have tails, are made of this thing called endochondral bone. So that's from a cartilaginous skeleton precursor that then ossifies. So you end up with cartilage, and then that turns into bone. All the bones in our head, or most of the bones in our head, come from this thing called intermembranous bone, which ossifies from collagen. So it's an entirely different developmental process between most of our body and the skulls of our head. And so it's not a huge leap to guess that the osteoderms might be derived from the same bones, right? So the intermembranous bone here is also called dermal bone because it evolves in the skin and then migrates inwards. So it's not a huge leap to suggest that the osteoderms are just the same genes associated with the osteoderms are the genes that are associated with the intermembranous bones. So this is a human skeleton, but this is probably derived from the earliest vertebrates or earliest jawed vertebrates. The fact that you have two different kinds of skeletons come from the two different skeletons in our earliest vertebrate ancestors, things called placoderms and ostracoderms. And so the most of the skeleton in a placoderm is cartilaginous, and it has these big bony plates in the skull. If you ever go to a natural history museum in the Midwest, you'll see thousands of these Dunkelostis giant fish, right? The earliest bones in vertebrate history were exoskeleton bones around the head, and they've since migrated inwards. This is the theory, not proven yet. They've migrated inwards to form the bones of the skull. Everything else was cartilaginous and ossified later. So if we can show that the genetic pathway of the osteoderms in mice is the same genetic pathway and the same developmental pathway as the skull bones in mice, we have a smoking gun for explaining how you can get so much diversity, so much re-evolution of these amazing traits across the vertebrate tree of life without losing the function of these objects. So that's, I know I left you with a very complicated thought, but I'd be very happy to talk about this more at lunch, and I'd be delighted to take any questions if you have any. Thank you so much for paying attention to this whole thing. Question, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, there's a microphone involved, sorry. And it can be anything about lizards or anything. It doesn't have to be about anything, if you want.
Is anything known about the evolution of armadillos?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, lots and lots. So armadillos have a pretty good fossil record because they tend to preserve well, right? I don't know, I don't want to overstate my knowledge about this thing, but there were certainly the large glyptodons, the things that looked like a Mini Cooper-sized armadillos were around here, and so that is an actual species of armadillo. There's actually a surprisingly large number of armadillo species around the New World these days. So we get the one species here, the 9-banded armadillo, but there's other ones that extend all the way down into South America, including giant armadillos that are this sort of big. You don't want to hit that with your car, but well, you don't want to hit any armadillo with your car, but yes, it would leave a dent. But there were even bigger ones in the past. So there were really, really gigantic ones, again, Mini Cooper-sized ones that had club tails and things as well. Those are the glyptodons. But they're close relatives of sloths and giant ground sloths and other things like that, and anteaters. So they're in that big group called Xenarthra that include anteaters and sloths. Yes, but there's actually there's a graduate student at the museum who's working on the evolution of brain shape in anteaters and sloths and armadillos. And she's come up with some very interesting results about how they're changing shape over time.
Any other questions?
The present-day reptiles have no relations to dinosaurs, just the birds?
It depends on where you draw the line of what a reptile is. So if you include birds in that group, then yes, absolutely, dinosaurs are reptiles. And so current understanding of how there's three major groups inside reptiles, right? There's lizards and snakes and tuataras. That's one group. There's what's called the archosaurs, which are birds, dinosaurs, and crocodiles. That's another group. And then the final group is the testudidans, or turtles. And so the three groups: lizards and snakes, birds and crocodiles, and turtles. And for a long time, there's been some confusion about which one's better, more closely related to the other. I think with both fossil evidence and molecular DNA evidence suggests now that turtles, crocodiles, and birds are all one group, and then lizards are outside of that. So you can call them all lizards, but you have to kind of concede that birds are a type of. Sorry, you can call them all reptiles, but you have to concede that birds are a type of reptile. They're just a very derived reptile. So yes, so birds are related to lizards in as much as they're more closely related to lizards than they are to mammals. But they're not each other's closest relatives. They're still crocodiles and dinosaurs and birds in one group there.
There's a lot of information here. One of the things that I have learned, I guess, is that there's different kind of bones in our ribs than there is in our skull.
Yes.
Now, chemically, all I know is that bones have calcium in them.
Right. Absolutely. So sorry, go ahead.
How, in what way are they different chemically?
Well, chemically, it is the same. It's the same basic makeup, right? But microstructurally and developmentally, they're quite different. So the bones in our skulls come from a collagen matrix, so a matrix of collagen that is laid down, and then osteocytes, these bones these cells that basically mineralize areas will go into the collagen and mineralize that out. It's the same process for the rest of our body, but that is a cartilaginous precursor, right? So it's cartilage rather than collagen that causes creates the kind of the mold, and osteoderms have just like the bones in our skull have a collagen-based precursor instead of that thing. So I just think it's just a fascinating fascinating fact that our skeleton is just a kind of a grab bag of developmental pathways that have kind of grown together rather than derived and gone elsewhere. I think that's just a very interesting and exciting.
I have a question, but as a former pediatrician, a good way to explain that difference between the skull and the bones of the body is a newborn baby has a soft spot and just has a membranous skull.
Yes.
In order that the head can come through the canal without fracturing something.
Absolutely.
The question I have is, you used a word as a synonym for camouflage that I'm not familiar with. What was that?
Crypsis? Crypsis.
How do you spell it?
Crypsys.
Like cryptic.
Like cryptic, yes.
I see.
Cryptic,
Thank you.
Yes. Like a cryptocurrency or cryptic crosswords. Oh yeah, I know. I wish I'd attended. I know nothing about it. So I have a hard time remembering where I put my money at the best of times. So if it's decentralized in the cloud, then I have no chance.
I want to take it back one step there. Where's the collagen for this? Is that right?
It's
from collagen.
Yes.
Okay, on the bones, where does the cartilage come from? The one step back.
So the cartilage so the cartilage crystallizes out of so there are cartilage cells that basically form a kind of a mold for your bone, and some bones, of course, never fully ossify, right? So the front of our ribs, my ribs, you can feel the ribs, are mostly cartilage, right? They're only partially ossified. This is why you can do CPR on people without exploding their. Exactly, that's right. It's all cartilaginous here. So it's just a different different developmental pathway. So the most. Well, so the different materials. No, yeah. So I see what you're saying. Yeah, but it's just different materials to basically map out the same bones. And actually, our collarbones are also derived from within the skin. And it's also different depths with our body. So our bones in our skull form in the dermis, in the skin, in the mesoderm. Yeah, mesoderm. Whereas the bones in the body form much deeper as well in the muscle layer. So there's a bunch of different developmental differences between these things. Yeah, but of course, if you can grow a skull, you have all the genetic architecture you need to be able to take those bones and put them somewhere else in the body. I think that's the critical part of this research.
I thought the question you were going to ask was about the other kind of bones. We have teeth.
Oh, yes. Well, well, there's some breaking news. Don't tweet this, but my colleagues have actually discovered a new type of biomaterial that is very much like enamel that caps on the top of some of the very, very thick osteoderms. So these osteoderms are actually have a lot of structural similarity to teeth in some ways, in as much as they have this enamel-like cap and then kind of a dentine-like, not really dentine because it's bone, like a plug. But yes, the similarities between the denticles of sharks and the osteoderms of fish and other vertebrates is very interesting. It's something we should look into. Are there any questions from the?
No, I don't see any from online, but I'll ask one real quick.
Okay.
When we had Doug Jones and he was talking about the future of the museum and how it's going to be changing, did you mention to me this morning
I
that
did.
how that's going to affect your lab?
Oh
or-
yes, absolutely. Sorry, yes. Thank you for the plug. Yes. So one of the reasons why I wanted to give this talk rather than any of the other talks I had was we are switching to the Natural History Museum and the Public Museum is switching to a cycle of putting out temporary exhibits that highlight research at the museums. And so there's calls for this sort of thing. And I thought it'd be really interesting to have an exhibit that focused on animal defenses, not just lizards, or not even just animals, of course, but defense in the animal in the natural world. So we can look at cacti and chemical defenses in trees, and all kinds of parallels between the chemical and the physical defenses of animals and plants and human beings. So that's one thing that we're excited to try and, well, if it gets accepted, will be, if you want to come by the Public Museum in a year or so, we should have an interesting exhibit with lots of fun interactives with this as well.
Yeah. Are bones something that developed later on? Did cartilage come first and then cartilage eventually became bones?
It does seem that way, yes. So if you think about a lot of early vertebrates like hagfish and lampreys and things, they have cartilaginous skeleton, but they don't have an ossified skeleton, all right?
Sharks.
Sharks also, yes. Although there's some question of whether sharks are secondarily cartilaginous, so they have bones and then lost the bony elements. And sharks actually have a really interesting thing where they've got certain certain cartilaginous bones that have mineralized, but they haven't mineralized the same way as bones do. So they have this very interesting calcification around the edge of the bones, especially for things that have to be tough, like the jaws. So that's why when you see a shark, like your shark jaws mounted on the wall, those are quite stiff because they have a coating of minerals around them that prevent them from falling apart when they're boiled. So.
Really interesting. Okay. Any further questions? No?
Nope.
Okay.
And I can leave my email if you have any questions about this, or you think of anything later you want to ask me, or I'd be delighted to keep on talking about this if you want.
Okay. Next week, the final talk of the series, Dr. David Blackburn is going to tell us how 3D imaging techniques are making the hidden world of the jars that you see in the back rooms are being made accessible to scientists and classrooms around the world. So we hope you'll come to that. And let's, again, thank Dr. Stanley.